Okay, everybody, this is House Education Thursday, February 20th, 2025. Continuing our discussion about instructional scale, kind of learning about it from the field. We've got four superintendents to sort of give us their thoughts on it, and we'll get started right away with Elaine Collins from North Country, who was good enough to offer her testimony from earlier while we elected our new trustees. Thank you.
Here for NHAA, any.
That's right.
There
And
you
today, I
go.
should point out, is Northeast Kingdom Day.
Well, thank you, folks. For the record, I'm Elaine Collins. I'm the North Country Supervisory Union Superintendent of Schools, and my testimony is more broad in scope because I wasn't intentionally in this instructional scale piece. So bear with me as I tend to be a bit talkative. My partner would tell me too much. So,
We like it.
many of you know that I'm a lifelong Vermonter. I'm a lifelong educator. I've spent the last 35 years working in Vermont's Northeast Kingdom schools. I've lived in Irisburg all but 12 years of my whole life. And so small town Vermont is where I come from and where I work. Between us, my partner and I have raised 10 grown children. We have 14 grandchildren, and all but 4 of those grandchildren live in Vermont, and 8 of them are North Country Supervisory Union students. To set our context, North Country has 12 educational sites, right? And I'm going to name them just because in the naming, you kind of get a sense of the broadness of them. Brighton Elementary School, Charleston Elementary School, Coventry Village School, Derby Elementary School, J. Westfield Elementary School, Lowell Graded School, Newport City Elementary School, Newport Town School, North Country Career Center, North Country Union High School, North Country Union Junior High School, and Troy School. We have about 2,750 kids. We have about 520 square miles between our whole region. When I looked at it on a map yesterday, it looked like a really small portion of our state, but when I'm in the car, it feels pretty big. We have about 65 miles from one end to the other. And on a day like yesterday, when I talked with 7 or 8 different principals about things that are popping up in their schools, it just made me wonder about the idea of one big district, ranging from Bradford to the Canadian border and to New Hampshire. What might that look like in terms of support for principals who have real problems every day? Not that we don't all have it. There is clunkiness on a district like North Country Supervisory Union. We did not unify in Act 46. That means that each of those sites are individual units. They have individual boards, individual budgets. There are 63 board members in North Country Supervisory Union. Some of those are repetitive, right? Some are executive committee or full board. Some are high school and junior high reps from their local boards, but 63 distinct board positions, 17 board meetings a month. So that in and of itself is a bit unsustainable, right? I've always been a little bit of a workhorse, but not everybody wants to do 17 board meetings a month. And there are months I don't really want to do that either. So I would agree that some of our governance structure is inefficient and should be adjusted and thought about. However, the contrast of one board, right, for a really large area maybe is too far in the other direction. So our work in the SU is complex in terms of its governance structure and maybe in the morality of our placement, but the work of our schools is very similar to all schools across the state. We view our supervisory union structure as a force multiplier. We can provide resources and supports at the SU level that small schools just can't provide on their own, and it would be too cost inefficient to do so. Behavior specialists, special ed teachers, neurodevelopmental team specialists, academic and SEL coaches, early childhood programming, the list goes on and on. That structure costs about $22 million for North Country Supervisory Union to run our central office. We bill back to schools $8 million. Because we manage a lot of grants and seek a lot of other economic supports for our SU, that's a good cost on investment or return on investment, right? I'm also here to talk about what we're experiencing in our corner of the state, and what I think used to be sort of a hidden agenda, but now is right out there agenda, and that is the privatization of public education. By making public education the enemy of taxpayers, we've become the scapegoat, right? For our entire Vermont history, public education has been a foundational pillar. Democracy needs and in fact demands a literate populace. In my opinion, the only way to keep our communities literate is to continue to offer a robust and healthy public education system. Our jobs in public education, as you know, have changed dramatically over the last 10 years. I would say even longer, but especially in the last 10 years. Our societal pressures change what we do in our schools every day because our kids are an effect of our society. We have an alarming number of students who experience mental health crises, historical or ongoing trauma, challenges with emotional regulation, behavior, food insecurities, housing insecurities, and then our communities don't have the ability to keep up. Our DCFs and our designated mental health agencies don't have the capacity to help us, so schools end up being the place. And in many of our communities, the only place that are feeding our kids, clothing our kids, providing for mental health, providing for basic needs, getting kids to the dentist, to the doctors, things that used to be parents, right? Used to be a parent's job or used to be the designated agency's job. We don't have that capacity in our area. So schools play that role. Subsequently, this puts more pressure on us, right? As an educational institution, and it drives up costs. So we, on the one hand, say schools are the only place where we can do this work. It's the only place where we take care of our children. And on the other, we get our hands spanked for spending too much money. And become, sort of demonized in the media. It's a really frustrating place for public education to be and for public educators to be in right now. So, as I said before, aside from the very public narrative that schools are one of the biggest problems in our state, I'm very concerned about the efforts to privatize education here. With our new plan for education that's been rolled out by someone who's led private education in another state, this sort of hidden or side narrative about privatization is now way out in the open and open for consideration. And because of the crisis of spending, it's got a lot more consideration than it ever has in the past. That's worrisome to me. I'm not concerned about privatization because I'm worried about protecting my job. Given the way my year has gone, remember PCB-induced tents for 720 high school students? Maybe a career change would be fine for me. But I am concerned about the population of students that I serve in the Northeast Kingdom. I'm not against private schools, but I do worry that we're using public dollars to fund private schools. With 120 private schools in our state, 86 of them are approved to accept state funding. For me, it's a matter of equity. Plainly stated, private education doesn't play by the same rules. Private institutions don't have to license teachers, perform assessments to report to the public about how they're doing, stay within spending caps, or implement legal mandates like PCB testing or special ed. Private schools can recruit and retain the most promising and academically strong students, and they can turn away students who don't fit that profile. With all the talk of right-sizing our schools to no less than 450 students in an elementary school, there's no talk about private institutions consolidating. Of the 86 private schools that receive public dollars, 53% of them have less than 50 kids. Specifically in the NEK, we're worried about the buzz about schools who are small by choice and not small by necessity. What does that mean? What's the criteria for small by necessity versus small by choice? I'm having a hard time understanding how closing 3 small elementary schools to build 1 larger school will save money. Eventually, but not immediately. The construction costs will outprice it. In the NEK, the voters in 2 towns, Morgan and Holland, have already closed their small schools. They tuition their students to Derby Elementary, a school of about 520 students. Morgan students, even kindergartners, even preschoolers, start loading the bus at 6:25 a.m. and don't get to school until almost 8, and then do the reverse at the end of the day. In our remote context, we have to think about whether increasing that time on the bus for more students is either fiscally responsible or just does it pass the common sense litmus test. I would ask you to consider what might happen if the privatization of education continues in our state. To illustrate what may be at best an unintended outcome, or at worst an actual planned for outcome, let me talk about North Country again. Across our SU, about 50% of our students qualify for free or reduced hot lunch. Some schools have a poverty index as high as 80%, while others have lower amounts. About 26% of our students qualify for special ed or 504 accommodations. Think about a student who's deemed homeless, living in poverty, may not have enough to eat, and has one or both parents who are struggling with addiction. Often this child doesn't come to school ready to learn. They may need food, clothes, and nurturing to be ready to access their education. That child's everyday reality is much different than a child who has a stable home environment where all their basic needs are met. Because North Country, like a lot of other SUs, has many more students who contend with these kinds of issues, our system has to be responsive to meet those needs. Enter the destabilization of public education dollars. This child who's struggling may not fit the mold of private education. If they're admitted into the private school, they may be kicked out, with public education being their only chance to get what they need. And if public dollars continue to erode, we won't have the ability to meaningfully educate those students with the most emergent needs. Many of you have heard my testimony before about the power of public education in my own life and in the lives of many of my students. So I'll end with this thought. Many of you remember that I was a child of trauma. I had natural resilient factors, including a robust public education that was built into my world, and I was able to eventually find my path. I grew up to raise 6 children, 2 of them adopted foster children, fostered 53 children in addition to my 6, have worked for 35 years in schools as a paraeducator, school secretary, library aide, middle school teacher, principal, and now superintendent. Thank God, not a bus driver. My whole life has been happily consumed by children. I have spent my life paying it forward. I was fortunate to have the chance to develop and learn resilience, and I have a moral obligation to do the same for the kids in my schools. We don't know the future paths of those kids, and it would be an unacceptable cost to take away the chance for them to flourish and grow from the next generation of Vermonters. It's foolhardy to think that change isn't necessary, and we know that it's in fact inevitable. We simply cannot continue to fund education the way we currently are. We are outpricing our own citizens from living in Vermont. We all know that there is a finite amount of money for any cause, including education. However, if our state believes that education is a basic human civil right as contained in our own Constitution, then when there are a lot of things to pay for, public education continues to be a priority. Let's not let someone else's agenda circumvent what we know to be the right work, and maybe what I would argue is the best and most impactful work. Let's work together to not only make Vermont affordable, but to also provide all children with the opportunity to realize their full potential. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thanks for accommodating our schedule change.
Sure.
I know that you did not come prepared to come and talk about instructional scale,
Yes,
but I hope you don't mind if our questions go in that direction.
certainly.
You brought up a point of what is a small school by choice and what is a small school by necessity. Do you think it's possible to come up with criteria, very objective criteria to be able to say which is which?
The devil's in the details, isn't it? So,
I'm not asking you to come up with it, but do you think it's possible?
yeah, I think as long as there's a caveat that you have to look at individual circumstances that may not fit those criteria, right? So I think that's the challenge in Vermont, is that because we're so rural and geography matters, broad sets of criteria won't fit every single circumstance. So, for example, Morgan and Holland closed. They had to, right? They had 30 kids. At one point, I think Morgan had 28 kids or something, and they closed. It was the right decision to make. And their community had the courage to do so. Not all communities have the courage to do so, and therefore we're in this place. But think about those kindergartners who were on that bus for an hour and a half one way or longer. That's a long time. Maybe if the superintendent got her bus driving license, we'd have more bus drivers and we'd be able to shorten those routes. But at this point in our evolution, we don't have the same number of resources that we used to. So we have to have really long bus routes for folks. So I think the long answer to that short question is yes, it is possible. As long as there is a mechanism in place to really consider independent contexts and situations.
And we didn't talk really about the other side of the equation. So it's not just money and scale, but additional opportunity for students.
Certainly.
And that's going to be part of the equation as well.
Yes, and I agree that there are opportunities, probably more appropriate opportunities for middle school and high school students to have to have the longer travel time and to be able to access better educational opportunities. I agree with that. You know, we're likely in a place where we're going to have to rebuild North Country, right? And what does that look like? It's sort of good timing in that sense, right? We have an opportunity to create something that might be larger than the current scale.
And I think, just correct me if I'm wrong or challenge me on this, but one of the benefits of going to a larger size district is that perhaps it's easier then to say, well, our district now includes Lake Region, and maybe we're going to take a closer look at combining Lake Region and North Country, whatever the combo. Which is, I think, a little more challenging right now, just because it's a complex process and everybody's busy doing their thing.
I think there are so many things to consider when you start combining CBAs, for example. You know, your bargaining agreements and who owns the debt, and is this a process that voters weigh in on, or is it a legislative process? Is it you know, how do you get seniority lists together, right? If you don't need as many teachers because you're combining things, whose seniority list trumps who, you know, like that's a real and complex problem in and of itself to think through.
We're not asking for complex problems anymore.
Will be the Rangers or the Falcons.
Right. And there's and I've thought about, would it make more sense in our time where we have a lack of middle school teachers for Lake Region to be a 7 through 12 and North Country to be a 7 through 12, and therefore you're still keeping, you're not muddying the waters as much by keeping districts in the same you know, CBAs and seniority lists and all of that, but you're expanding opportunities for middle school. Maybe that's a way to go. I don't know.
And any other questions from the committee? I'm sitting here taking up time.
No, but sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's not a question. I appreciate this other choice that I hadn't thought of, which is both becoming 7 through 12. Like, I wonder about the capacity of the buildings to absorb all our 7th and 8th graders. I'm more thinking of Lake Region than North Country, but
I didn't mean to get us into like actual scenario.
oh, but that's a good idea. I mean, that's one worth having on the table that I hadn't thought of.
One thing that you brought up that has been kind of weighing on my mind as we think about, as you say, a district that goes from Bradford to the Canadian border.
Mm-hmm.
And I think about those principals who are out in a smaller, somewhat isolated rural school, and what becomes their touch point. I mean, right now, I think superintendents are very busy. We've got 52 of them. They don't seem to have a lot of time on their hands, but that's because they're often dealing with all those day-to-day things, because the principal's often the only extra adult in their small elementary school other than the teacher. I just bring that up as a.
And you know, I spent 11 years as an elementary school principal in a small school for 5 years and a larger school for 6 years. And your superintendent has to have your back, right? There has to be somebody who has the buck stops here. We will lose principals if we don't support them. So part of the reason why I spend so many hours in the car traveling from place to place is because we do principal coaching. And, you know, I spend an hour to an hour and a half with 7 principals, 7 of our 18 principals in North Country, talking to them about their problems with practice and touching base with them. That would be very difficult to do in a really mega-sized district, right? And so I think what you would have to do, practically speaking, is have just a lot of middle management folks, right? You'd have to have some more assistant superintendents or other people who are managing this region and that region. I just don't see a cost savings in that, and does it really make sense? So I think having some really careful and thoughtful modeling is going to be extraordinarily important change does need to happen. I'm not against change, just change that doesn't make sense, right? Or creates a lot of really unintended consequences that we can't foresee because we're rushing to get to a solution without really thinking it through carefully. Think about, when we talked about PCBs, and I said something to the effect of, when we make policy and we don't ask people who are on the ground how that's going to affect them, we always end up with bigger problems, right? And that's kind of what's happened here, right? This plan has been rolled out with no input from anybody essentially to begin with. Now they're getting input, but it's the horse is out of the barn, right? It's almost too late to get a sense of what makes sense or what doesn't. It's already out. So
Thank you very much. Appreciate your time.
thank you.
Okay, we are going to switch to the TV screen, and Randy Lowe, you are up. Welcome, and thanks for joining us.
Hi, thanks for having me. I apologize for not being in person. I am out of town this week. We're on break, so I'm working from another location. So can you hear me okay?
Yeah, coming through great. Yeah, thank
Okay.
you.
Perfect. So my name is Randy Lowe, and I'm the superintendent for the Bennington Rutland Supervisory Union down in the greater Manchester area. I provided some written testimony. I'm going to follow it sort of. So I'm not great with just kind of reading from a script necessarily. So if there are things that I don't talk about in the detail that you'd like, please feel free to ask me to talk a little bit more about something once we through this. So Bennington Rutland Supervisory Union serves about 2,200 students pre-K through 12. And we have 3 member districts with a pretty complex structure. So I've got one that's a non-operating district who has school choice for all of their students. It's not a huge number, just over 100 students. The Meadowee School District serves kids in one elementary school for grades K to 6, and then they tuition out for 7 through 12. And then the Taconic and Green School District, which is our largest district, services 9 towns. And has 5 schools, and they operate pre-K to 8 and then tuition for high school. So we are also pretty large, the second largest geographic footprint in the state. And again, we've got kind of that complex organization. So I consider the role of superintendent to be primarily education quality, providing the best education we can to our students, and being actively involved in doing all we can to make that happen, and fiscal responsibility. I feel like those are sort of the 2 big buckets for our work. And we've really tried to right size our system over the last 7 to 8 years. So we do have class size parameters that we follow. Our elementary grades K to 3, we want 15 to 18 students in each classroom. And in grades 4 through 8, we want 18 to 24 students. And we're able to meet those numbers pretty easily in our larger schools, but we struggle much more in our elementary schools. I mean, in our smaller schools. So I've kept an eye on enrollment. We've had declining enrollment across our system. And really, well, let me just jump to this. So we've had declining enrollment. We've also, that declining enrollment we observed a few years ago was really affecting our middle school programming. We don't have separate elementary schools. Separate middle schools. We have 3 schools that are K-8 or pre-K-8. So I've got, a school that's got like 22 7th graders and 3 8th graders. So we were just identifying limited opportunities, variable opportunities for our students in middle school. There was just huge variability between our schools, which didn't feel great to me as a superintendent. And for literally probably 2 decades, the greater community has been talking about a regional middle school. So we started talking about it about 2 years ago. And if we could bring our kids together and have a 21st century middle school opportunity for our students in grades 6 through 8, what could that be? I don't know that there's any school that kind of provides what I would love to provide for our students. So how might we build something, construct something, do a renovation, and what might that program look like? So we spent a couple years on that. What we realized though last year was that we couldn't really talk about that in isolation. That once we started considering consolidating the middle school students, that left pretty big gaps for us for our elementary kids. So schools that were already having declining enrollment were going to be faced with a whole set of challenges. So we completed a facility review on the 5 schools to say, all right, what's the condition of our buildings? Let's try to get the big picture we can about what's going on. That process combined with my pretty tight analysis of kind of the big picture of educational programming led me to say to the Taconic and Green board last summer, hey, I just don't think we're doing as well as we could be, both financially or educationally, and we need to be talking about our entire K-8 program. So, so when we looked, part of that analysis was looking at our schools. So we have a couple schools that have about 50 students. One is a pre-K 5 school, the other one is a K to 6 school. And so we have multi-age classrooms. So in one of the schools, it's a K6, I have 4 teachers. So there's sort of this anomaly of a kindergarten class with 17 students, which you can imagine that's a large class for that school. So that class has 1 teacher, and then I've got 3 teachers for grades 1 through 6. We have adopted over the last couple of years really, really strong tier 1 curricular resources for math, for ELA, and for social sciences, but that requires fidelity of instruction. I want to make sure that we've got a really solid foundation for all of our kids vertically and horizontally in our system. So our principals and our teachers really heard that. When you have multi-age classrooms and you are trying to meet rigorous state level standards, that is very, very difficult to teach both multiple grade levels. In some cases, I've got 3 or 4 grade levels to get that instruction with fidelity. So we have our interventionists who we've hired to provide that tier 2 intervention level instruction, now teaching classroom instruction so that we make sure that the kids are getting what they need, which means we're dismantling our MTSS system, and the kids who need that intervention aren't able to get it. That's very concerning to me, because we know what best practice is, we know what we want our students to receive, but we're stuck with this idea of how do we right-size and be as fiscally responsible as possible while also trying to provide the best education we can for our kids. So that's one of the key drivers. You can see the list. I've got other things that were really contributing to this for me as well. We didn't have flexibility of opportunities. We have itinerant shared staff between buildings. Again, it's from an economic perspective, right? If I've only got 4 classes of kids, I don't need a full-time person. I really only need somebody to be there at that building teaching art or teaching music, 1 day a week, maybe a day and a half. But then you have personnel who are split between multiple schools. And educators really like going into education to be part of a school community. That sense of community is really meaningful and important to them. And so when you're working between multiple buildings and you don't ever really feel a part of a community, it leads to a really high turnover rate. It's also not, it's not as efficient of a system as possible. And then, I think the last couple bullets are important, right? You don't have folks, teachers don't have people to really collaborate with in their building, to be able to analyze data, to talk about lesson planning, to talk about tricks of the trade that they're learning as they're implementing, and to like level each other up. If you've ever had the opportunity to work with, if you're like a third grade teacher and you get the opportunity to collaborate every week with a group of third grade teachers within your building, and somebody says, "Oh my gosh, did you know we could do this?" or "Did you know this?" and then that like keeps leveling up the instructional program, right? Everybody grows from each other, which I've had the experience of working in systems like that, and it's really energizing. And then services, right? If you've got a school of, I'll say 50 kids in my case, and we've got a part-time counselor there, for instance, or a part-time special educator, we can provide services, right? Per a 504 plan or EST plan or IEP plan. Those people come in, they do the services, and they leave. We're not necessarily violating any laws or violating any documents for students, but if that student really needs to access a particular individual and they're not in the building, it can be really challenging for some of our kids. And maybe there is, maybe there are one or two students who really could benefit from daily contact with a mental health professional, a school counselor. And, I can't justify a full-time person there for so few kids. So all of that from the instructional model was really, really difficult for me. And that was really what I brought to the board, saying, I'm concerned. I just feel like we are reaching that point where we need to be looking at consolidating. If we can provide a more stable system with less variability that is buffered to some extent to the impacts of the enrollment challenges we're facing, I think we can do better. I also think we can be more financially stable than we are right now. So the board said, yeah, okay, let's talk about this more. We went this fall and had some public forums, and oh goodness. So
I went to one.
yes. I know. I know. So I made a presentation, the same presentation, all except for the first one, which is another story that really is irrelevant, so I'm not going to go into details. What I really heard, I kind of captured in 5 statements here. And I believe you all know this. I don't believe anything I'm saying is going to be a novel to you. But people really, really, really want to keep their small schools open. Um, it was really fascinating to me to listen. First of all, my community members were fabulous, right? People were very invested. This is the most energy, the most involvement, the most participation we've seen in my 5 years that I've been superintendent. And I found folks to be really, really respectful, passionate, curious, uh, and it was an exhausting and frankly kind of taxing experience, but I am very, very glad that we went through it. People really understood status quo is not an option. They heard the message that something needs to change, but it was very clear, not my school. So for the board, right, we went through every single community. We met at every single school, and we were all able to have that same shared experience of, well, now what? Now what are we gonna do, right? Like, and so, um, perception is really big. I'm confident I'm not alone in the fact that within a district, there are certain schools with certain reputations. Those reputations may be based in fact, they may be based in history, they may be based on gossip, they may be based on just about anything. But to be able to provide uh, input to help folks to understand things differently than how they believe it is very, very, very difficult. So, so then the board said, all right, Randy, why don't you give us a proposal? So I said that proposal would come between February and April of this year. And then I had we've been doing all kinds of work. I've been working with architects. I've been working with just pages and pages and pages of data, right? What makes sense? What's financially most responsible? What's educationally most responsible? And then in January, I walk into the world that you're in right now. And I'm like, well, now what am I going to do? What does all of this mean for our work in the BRSU? And that's not your issue, that's mine. And I actually have a very good plan. I feel good about where I'm going. But as we look at what could be, how many districts do we have? How do we consolidate as a state? Where are those economies of scale, both educationally and instructionally and financially? I am confident. I just had the privilege of listening to Elaine talk about North Country, and there is no doubt in my mind that you are hearing from a whole lot of people who see this very, very differently. So I do not envy your position at all. But this is what I'll say. I'm skipping over a bunch of stuff here, but I want to get to this last point. I think it is really, really important that the guidance and clear direction comes from the state level. If I have, I don't know. I don't know what level of political, social, educational capital I have in my community right now. I think it's okay. I think it's pretty good. I don't think it's great. I don't think it's terrible. But I think it's naive for any of us in the educational community to think that moving to, let's say, half as many or a fraction of as many systems as we've got now is going to be an easy process, is going to be well received by the majority, is going to be smooth sailing. So I think about, if I were to be in a position ever to lead something, you want to be set up for success. And so if the narrative is we're not saying to close small schools, and that's what the general population of people is hearing, but then what is handed to the new governing operational leaders is, okay, if there's all this criteria and your school doesn't meet it, then you need to close schools. That, like, I think that the disconnect in messaging, whenever you decide, okay, this is what we're going to roll out, we need to be consistent and we need to be honest and transparent with people about what actually is happening. I think the right thing for our system is to be right sizing. I don't know where my community will be with that. It would be my work would be easier if somebody said, hey, if you've got 3 or 4 grade levels and you've got, we in some places have 3 kids in a grade or 4 kids in a grade. And so maybe I have 3 grade levels that have 11 kids total, right? If there's a way that people can be really, really direct and clear, and talk about the details, like Elaine said, I'm sure that you've heard that from a lot of people. The devil is in the details, right? It matters. And so taking the time to think through things and discuss what might it look in the BRSU or in North Country or in Slate Valley or in Burlington, South Burlington, I think that there's a lot of opportunity. I think that you've got people across the state in my position very, very willing to work with you, willing to offer suggestions and throw ideas on the table and move to greater consolidation and fewer districts. And so I really appreciate you giving me the time to talk at you for a while. I apologize for that. I'm excited to be a part of the journey, a little bit nervous, but ultimately really on board with change that is done well.
Thank you very much. I think you kind of bring up what we all struggle with and gave me a little PTSD about standing up in front of crowds talking about footprint of your school district. Having been there myself. Our first rule was we don't make the superintendent do it, but the testimony you provide here where everybody understands the status quo is not an option, but nobody's willing to accept the change. To me, I think to myself, well, what is it Vermonters really want? And I think that's what we wrestle with. And we know what they really want. They really want lower property taxes and to keep the same system that we have, except where they don't want it and can change it. So I think, you are a microcosm of the bigger stuff, and we're now sitting here a little bit as the school board, figuring out how we go before the public and say, say we need to move away from the traditional way we've been doing things. But that wasn't a question, right? I apologize. But I guess I was thinking about this sort of state mandate for class size, school size. We keep talking about that, but especially school size. And it seems to me there needs to be some entity that says, if you don't meet it, we are going to close you down, or you're going to come and make your case and then sort of rule on it. What do you think about that, since you're recommending that we perhaps need things like school size?
Yeah, I mean, certainly not. I feel like my comments are not popular. I don't even know what that means to be popular in this discussion anyway, but I do. Right. I mean, you probably all get that as well. I do think that there needs to be some very clear, unambiguous direction, because that is how things will move forward. And if things are going to change, which it appears that they are, then you need to make sure it changes in a way that is best poised to improve opportunities, experiences, and outcomes for our students, and at a cost that is more stable and less volatile and more transparent for everyone involved. And it can't be soft. Soft doesn't lead to meaningful change. And you run the risk of going through a whole lot of work and not having it be what was intended.
Katie, questions? Opportunity.
No, I mean, Randy, hi, Randy. I think that, it was really your words at one of our meetings a couple months ago. And I kept that in my pocket and brought it with me because I was at that Sunderland meeting and I saw what happened. And then, I saw the headlines for all the other meetings that you did. Same thing, everybody's in favor of closing someone else's school. But I just want to say, I like, the thing that you said was you needed a mandate. If I'm going to move forward, create this regional middle school, consolidate here, I need some power. I need some cover to be able to do that. And, I appreciate your forward thinking in everything that you do down there in the BRSU. So, I mean, I brought that with me. So thanks. It's not a question. There.
It's a great statement.
There you go.
If you're going to violate the rule, it's a good statement to have.
There you go.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Randy. Appreciate your time this afternoon and your testimony. I think we should all take a time to read it.
And wherever you are, I hope it's warm.
Oh, it's definitely not warm. I wish it was warm, but it's not. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. I appreciate your time this afternoon. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Randy.
All right. Wendy, you're up next. Welcome. Yeah, introduce yourself to everybody and
Sure. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. I'm Wendy Baker. I'm the superintendent of Addison Central School District. which serves the towns of Bridport, Cornwall, Ripton, Middlebury, Salisbury, Shoreham, and Weybridge. It's taken me 9 months in the position to be able to say those all without looking at a cheat sheet. And I come to this committee as a multi-generational Vermonter. In fact, my family settled in Panley, which is just up the road from where I report to work every day, which is nice. And I spent 20 years in the Vermont system, dedicating between 60 and 80 hours a week to ensuring that kids in my classroom, kids in all the schools around the state, in Orange East Supervisory Union, where I was a superintendent, and People's Academy middle level, where I was a principal, got good instructional opportunities, and schools developed well. And then I spent 10 years in roughly the higher ed space, serving the educational field from that standpoint. And my testimony for you today, it thinks about scale in a couple different ways. And rather than read from it, I'll speak to it, and I'm happy to take you wherever you'd like to go. So one of the things that I want to talk about is the way that accessible scale has played out in Addison Central over time. And you might consider that as you are thinking about what to do in this very moment. I'd also like to split the difference in terms of instructional scale and operational scale. A lot of what you've been talking about, as I've listened to the testimony of my colleagues and your questions, refer to operational scale. And that's a difference. Someone with the background like mine in school improvement thinks about instructional scale, which really thinks about how do you raise the capacity of the instructional moments that students are experiencing every day to a level where more students are experiencing that across classrooms, across schools, and then, ultimately when I was at the Department of Education, across districts. So I want to make sure that's an important distinction, and I want to bring that up to you. I have 3 recommendations for you, and I'll take them in reverse order. I'll talk about the one that I think we need to spend the least time on first, and move on to the one that I think is the most important. So in Addison Central, when unification took place under Act 46, they got to work in a hurry, and they became an IB World District with a coordinated curriculum that is impressive. It is fully integrated. It was politically difficult. However, it is a point of pride, and we currently are the only school district in the country that is going through a simultaneous K through 12 NEASC accreditation, which is unusual, and IB reauthorization after that has been in place for 5 years. That has held our smallest schools. We have schools that are right now at the size of 38, up to 350 in terms of our elementary schools, and then a middle school that has 384 and a high school with 530. So it's held our smallest schools together. It's held those classrooms together. We have 184 classrooms across Addison Central. And those classrooms have avoided in some share some of the challenges that some of my colleagues have shared this morning, that have related to not having shared units that are supported by curriculum expertise and so on and so forth, so that we're hanging together. And each 3rd grader across Addison Central can have roughly the same experience instructionally as it relates to those things. And so districts of our size, we're 1,750 pre-K through 12 students, roughly. We were staffed for about 15% above that. And we were able to provide that scale. We would be able to provide the same scale with very few more staff, double the size. So there is something about strong districts that can support smaller schools, which are probably going to be a part of our landscape, for some time, given some of the things that you're considering. The other thing I want to talk about is school viability, which is operational scale in part. There are, according to John Castle, which he has wonderful resources related to this. There are really 4 areas where school viability, which is where, you know, can classroom viability come together around school viability, comes into play. One of them is operational feasibility, financial feasibility, educational outcomes, and then community kind of identity or community context in that sense. It would be helpful, and it is my recommendation that you consider adding a standard to the district quality standards, which I would highly suggest that no one ignores. These are to come into play July 1st, 2025, which is coming. And I would suggest to you that the Agency of Ed start getting ready to support districts to meet those standards and to determine how to proceed when or if that's not possible after guided support over time. In that district set of district standards, you could add a school viability standard, and you could speak to each of those areas. For example, you might say that that small schools cannot operate at a financial level that is more than 20% of the per pupil cost of any student that is in any other school. And you could add some financial feasibility markers in there. You could add educational outcome markers. You could add some markers in there, and I'm quite certain if you opened yourself up for testimony around that you'd flood, the gates would flood. You won't have to make it up. You could add those in there so that we're able to have some conversations about some common pieces that aren't my idea or our board's idea or our community's idea or our community's ideas for each other or anything else. It's a common set of metrics. You could also add, the secretary could require an annual report from superintendents that determines what is the viability of each of the schools that are under your care, that works with those metrics. And in doing so, if the superintendent sees that, if the secretary sees that a superintendent whose license depends, right, on providing information to the Agency of Education with integrity, that, this is a flag, we have a viability flag here, then the secretary can develop a process to determine where is that, and then can begin to move that forward. So I think there's a way to bring that into a different realm that is not only in the political context that Randy's describing, right? And that makes it challenging, that Peter's lived through, in Addison Central when they kind of try to have some of these conversations, community-wide. The third and the most important recommendation that I'd like you to hear from me today, and partly because of my experience in the state, largely between 2000 and 2012, which were years where we had an upward trajectory that related to student achievement. And during that time, we had a commissioner that reported to a state board. What is important for me to say about that today is that is an accessible scaling for us that creates a thread that pulls instruction up. It would be just like if Addison Central didn't have a superintendent and the principals were sort of running around trying to figure out, well, I don't know, this math program looks good, doesn't it? Or we could do it this way, couldn't we? If having the superintendent says, let's all get together and talk about this, how can we move forward about this? Some of the things that happen under educational leadership that a commissioner of education provided are making sure that when we are facilitating state contracts around assessments, that there are provisions that ensure item analysis that's released to the field so that the field understands what is the target for achievement and has supports to be able to understand if they're getting there. Things of this nature, and never mind working with superintendent groups to say, what do you need? How can we provide that exponential force that Elaine described so that the efforts of superintendents in the field are augmented and amplified exponentially? When you have somebody who is an educational leader in the position and not a political appointee, not having to contend with the need to do political leadership, probably 75% of the time, that's where your focus is. And that's how the field sees you. And that is if you want to change, in my opinion, my humble opinion, since you invited me to come and provide it, If you want to change the conditions for kids in this state instructionally, you will make that change at that level. And I don't say that lightly. And I don't say that as it relates to anything Secretary Saunders has expressed during her time here. We have gone through, since this change, we have gone through 4 very hardworking secretaries, 2 governors, and 2 separate political parties. So it is not related to any agenda that is in any one of those folks, along the way. When you are a political appointee, your reality is very different. And I think Armando Villaseca testified a bit from his experience related to that. And I think that's important. If you have a hard time just sort of, feeling that, if that's not your lived experience, think about whether you'd want your superintendent to be appointed by the governor. The characteristics and qualifications of that person might be quite different from the ones that are necessary in order to be licensed and, in the position in a more traditional way. So the only other thing that I would want to share is you've heard already, and that is coming back to the point of accessible scale. Scale, I had the experience, as I told you in my testimony, of being able to be supported to grow and scale wildly with a wonderful educational set of graduate programs that went from 200 participants to 20,000 participants. That is good scale. And we were supported wildly to do that by an organization in Southern New Hampshire University that knew scale and knew how to do that, knew the stages of scale. I feel like I got a master's degree in business administration just by learning the things that people there knew about how to get from point A to point B. There were teams of people, teams of legal people who understood this, accreditation people who understood this, finance people who understood this. They knew how much money to give me when I wanted to grow. No, you can't have that much, you can have this much. This is the stage you're at. They knew those things. I didn't know those things. I was naive to any of that. That had never been any of my experience. So we don't have that right now at the state level. There's no one around that has that. Sometimes it's very hard to reach somebody by phone at the Agency of Education. And the emails have gone from a person to a department in that sense. I am not disparaging any of the 181 people who work there, but we don't have that. I personally would love to have 181 people in my department to accomplish anything. And I think we need to come together and get that right before we take on something that's going to impact 83,000 children in a scaling situation that is not set up to go well. From my experience of enjoying a circumstance that was, with educational consequences, as I describe in my testimony, that take out the transformative aspects of learning. Right, the things that you have left are the things that are replicable, the things that will contribute to an efficient system that can be done with lower skilled folks that are in it, and in ways that are dependable and steady, but not transformative and representative of the excellence that we have come to expect. So that's my testimony for you today. I appreciate you inviting me here, and I'm happy to help you in any way I can.
Could you talk a little bit, just looking through your testimony, about ACSB's efforts to increasing the scale of your classrooms, what that did, but then you have another paragraph about the barriers to student achievement.
Yes. So one of the things that's really important, and I appreciate the prompting, Peter, for me to let you know also, is that you're speaking about class size and you're not yet, as I've heard you, speaking about grade size. So grade size, the important difference in that is that means that data is publicly reportable, not just state assessment data. So that if you have third graders and you have more than 11 of them, then that data is publicly reportable. So I can throw it up for my board, in all of my different schools, and they can see how all the third graders are doing in all of the places and what that looks like. We do not have that in Addison Central in most of our schools. We have it in only Mary Hogan School. We don't have it reliable in any of our other 6 elementary schools. And there is a wide disparity in performance that I think, you know, whether I should have or not, we shared all of that with my board in executive session, and it was alarming. And they didn't know that because that can't come, it's not reportable, and other superintendents didn't choose to do that. So I said to them, we need to change this. And because I have a school background, and I knew that, you know, instructional specialists that could help bring up math content among some of our elementary school teachers, scale up some of our high impact and high leverage strategies that I knew were needed. We have the wonderful curricular pieces in place, but not necessarily the capacity from working together around those things to be able to make that translate into outcomes. So the way we got there was to simply implement the class size policy they had, which had a 10 student minimum. And, you know, that had not been done. It was probably uncomfortable to do prior to that time. So we had some classes of 6 and 7 and 8 and so on and so forth throughout the district. So we went from an overall average class size of 11 to an average class size of 15. That freed up about $720,000, which, as long as the voters, you know, will be as generous as they have been in other years coming up, we will be able to reinvest those funds into instructional specialists in math and literacy to be able to pick up that first level instruction, which will help us flip from a whole lot of recovery efforts, you know, and not as much investment in our first tier to greater investment in our first tier and fewer recovery efforts, which will ultimately save the district other funds, you know. So actually by changing class size, that was all about trying to ensure that kids are achieving better. It's all about student success. And that's the path that we've gone down, you know, in that respect. What was the other thing you wanted me to say, Peter?
No, that was actually, those 2 things were the 2 things I really wanted you to hit.
Okay.
But, you know, your class size minimums is not yet a reality, because, well, how are you going to handle it if, in the case of your small school, the enrollment shows that you aren't hitting those class size minimums?
So
is that to be TBD, or is that?
No, our board, I have to commend our board. I mean, they, as Peter knows, the Addison Central Board has had a tough time coming together over time around how best to handle the smaller schools and the larger schools and what to do. And although they don't always agree, they are very brave, and they are absolutely committed to doing the right thing by each of these classrooms that we have, period. That's just it. And so they actually have just revised, as is explained in my testimony, our class size policy, such that we only have 2 grades. So that part that's in the committee bill that you've read, we're already ahead of you there. You know, we have to have 10 in 2 grades. If you don't have 10 in 2 grades, then their choice was to see if there are other ACSD families who would like to join the unenrolled grade. If not, the superintendent moves the students as a cohort to another school determined, you know, by me, by a procedure I have yet to write. So, so that, and of course, you know, we have Ripton Elementary School that is facing that circumstance right now. They're scheduled to have 11 students in K1, 2, 3, which doesn't meet that policy that was just passed. So we have those invitations out for families, and those are due back by March 3rd. And then, you know, we'll determine whether or not, which direction we're going to go based on the feedback that we get from families. Yeah.
Well, very real world experience with exactly the problems.
One of the other things that I would say about that, actually the Ripton experience, is that, and people know that, you know, Ripton is a very strong community that has had very strong feelings about their school. That's played out over time. That is still very true. What we've been able to do actually relates to Jay's testimony that he provided about Erie, you know, and the community process and involvement and engagement, where you show up and you talk about data, not with a predetermined conclusion in mind, just here's where we are. How are you seeing this? And how do we keep talking about this? They actually held a beautiful meeting that they invited me to, where they began to brainstorm ways forward for their building that may or may not have anything to do with K-5, and they will need, if that's the direction that this goes, they will need those supports. They will need a community planner that comes from the agency of something different and says, hey, I'm here. Where are you? And what does that look like? That's out of my depth. That's beyond our scope as a school district. And that's what they will need. And that will help them kind of move ahead, in those directions. And I think that would be very appreciated if it comes to that.
So just having been part of this story, what we're really seeing here is the difference between when I was there and sort of leading in charge of major change versus that didn't work out so well. Just for the same reasons that Randy Lowe spoke about and her to sort of incremental change, really, I guess I would call it data-driven incremental change. And perhaps addressing it in a way that it's different and probably easier to absorb.
I also think, and this actually relates to maybe a comment I might make about what do you do with districts? How far do you go with districts? And what's your bailiwick? And then what should you leave, to other people? When I did my doctoral program, my dissertation was on effective community engagement practices. And I actually, the case study that I did was around Addison Northwest Supervisory Union at the time, that they were doing their very first vote to come together. It was in 2003. And that didn't go well for them. And so my part in that was to determine how did they engage the community and how did that work with, standards of practice in the medical field, nutrition, and many others. And I think there is something to be said about a local process. So I like, if I can be so bold to give you yet another recommendation, I appreciate the importance of intent language. If you were, for example, to say it is our intent to move to a county-wide district structure, and you were to instruct task force within counties, with the help of independent folks, to get together and report back at the beginning of the next legislative session about what that looked like, similar to the RED studies that went on, prior, right? So you get together and you look at that and you figure out all the things that the business managers talked about and all the things that are around the buildings and the politics and so on and so forth. And you ask for countywide reports that come back around, well, this is what that looks like for us. Oh, here's what we found as a challenge, and here's what we found as a challenge. And I think if you did that, you would allow people on the ground to be able to get into the process, talk to each other, and determine, what's important and where are we and how can we move ahead. You could have some counties that come back and say, yeah, we have to be 2, we have to be 3, whatever it is, right? And others that are saying, we're all set. If you want us to do this tomorrow, we need maybe 3 years to get the bank accounts in the right direction and all of the assets and liabilities swapped over, but that's what we'd like to do. So I don't want you to underestimate the importance of local involvement at the right time with the right task. And I think you have some of those opportunities in front of you.
Great. Any other questions, committee? Thanks very much. Thanks for coming over.
Yeah, thanks for the chance to be here. It's a privilege.
Would you like to tell the committee what you're doing later on this afternoon?
I'm here in person because I officiate high school basketball. And so I'll be in the Mount Mansfield contest.
You're around.
Yes. I'm a
Wow,
basketball
that's a
player.
hard job.
Yes, yeah. It makes the superintendent part easy.
Thank you, Wendy. All right. We have batting cleanup here, Patrick Green from Mount Abe. Welcome, Patrick. Floor is yours.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having me, and thanks for all of your hard work. I feel like I've been saying this a lot for the last several years. These are unprecedented times, and it's really important and really difficult work that you all and we all are tasked with right now. So my name is Patrick Green. I'm superintendent for the Mount Abraham Unified School District. I'm in my 9th year as superintendent. Just for some context, we are in the northeastern portion of Addison County, a little less than 1,200 students in 4 towns, Bristol, Moncton, New Haven, Starksboro. Each of those towns has an elementary school that range in size from about 80 to 250 students. All of our elementary schools feed into our middle high school, which is Mount Abraham, with a 712 enrollment of about 575 students. For some additional context, Lincoln was once a member town in our school district. Though they're no longer a member town, most of Lincoln's grade 7-12 students do attend Mount Abraham. And just to bring it home in the Vermont context, I live in Lincoln, which is the town that withdrew from the district where I'm superintendent. So that adds a little bit of the political context to the work. In my 9 years here, this is my 9th year, so in those 9 years at MAUSD, we have merged into a unified district under Act 46. We've reduced year-over-year spending twice, navigated a global pandemic, unsuccessfully explored school consolidation, unsuccessfully explored merging with Addison Northwest, failed 2 bond attempts, and there was a 3rd failure just the year prior to my starting. We had 1 member town withdraw from our district, that's Lincoln. Had a 2nd member town very nearly withdraw. If one of the other towns hadn't voted it down, they would also have withdrawn, that's Starksboro. And we've experienced weighted pupil decline almost every single one of those 9 years that I've been superintendent.
Are you putting all of this on your resume?
Yeah. It might be on my tombstone. I don't know about resume. So in short, really, for several years now, we have been deeply engaged in the tremendously difficult work of trying to achieve scale to give our students the kind of experiences and opportunities that they deserve at a cost that our taxpayers can afford. All of these efforts over this near decade have resulted in no increased scale. In fact, scale has decreased over that time. We've not consolidated schools. We have not merged districts. In fact, what was 3 districts in Addison County is now 4 and was almost 6 with Starksboro and Ripton very, very nearly completing their withdrawals. So going sort of a little more historical context, going back to 2019, myself and my 2 superintendent colleagues at the time, Peter Burrows from Addison Central and Sheila Sewell from Addison Northwest, we went to the Secretary of Education and said, we really think there needs to be 1 school district in Addison County. That's the kind of scale, at least at the superintendent's level, at the central office level, that we need to do to pursue this idea of equity and opportunity, as well as affordability. Affordability is a key piece to this, but there's much more to this than affordability. It really is about equity and opportunity. Because it was clear that that kind of scale was needed. We advocated for this change knowing that it would mean that 2 of the 3 of us don't have a job anymore, and pretty close to 2/3 of our central office staff don't have jobs anymore. But we knew it was so important that it was important to pursue that anyway. The response we got, this was just on the heels of Act 46, was basically there's no appetite for Act 46 2.0 right now. Which was disheartening, and we were kind of left on our own. So since then, MAUSD has explored closing and repurposing schools, merging with Addison Northwest, and local leaders, primarily superintendents and school boards, are the ones that have been left to do that work. Despite our efforts and years of community engagement, we haven't achieved any of that scale. Though all of the political capital we put into this is gone, we just haven't seen a return on that investment of political capital. So, driving to the point that I was asked to really focus on today, which is merger study, our merger study process between Addison Northwest and MAUSD, even though we knew we weren't going to get support for a single Addison County school district, the superintendents and school boards of MAUSD and Addison Northwest agreed that it would be worthwhile to pursue a merger of at least our 2 school districts. Very similar demographically, similar struggles in terms of being able to provide programming at reasonable costs, etc. And the decision that was made by those 2 boards came after Sheila and I, the superintendent from Addison Northwest, worked with our teams to model what could the potential savings and program benefits be if we did merge. And in our efforts, we estimated that the savings at that time from central office consolidation alone would be about 1.3 million just between our two districts. Additionally, if we were to then merge middle and high schools, we were estimating that that would save another almost $2.5 million annually while increasing programming for students. Some of the programs we were looking at being able to increase were in the design technology, world languages, alternative programs kind of realm. So that's a total savings of $3.75 million annually while increasing programming. So, you know, our analysis of this was it makes sense to pursue this as a way to provide for our students and create some savings for taxpayers. And the whole while, what was a challenge was there's a desire, as I suspect there is now, to compare a merged reality with our current reality. That isn't a comparison you can make because our current reality is not an option. What has to be done is we need to compare a future unmerged reality with a future merged reality and try to understand what the pros and cons of those two are. As we made those comparisons, it was clear where we will be if we don't merge is more costly and less effective for students than if we did. So with that information, we pursued the merger, and the boards agreed that we would consider, we would form this merger study committee, and we moved that forward. In addition to those savings that we were talking about, we were also looking at school consolidation and MAUSD. And our calculations were if we closed 3 of our 5 schools, which we could do at the time, this was when Lincoln was with us, and put all of those students into the other schools that we have with not needing to have any construction projects to create space, we were looking at saving about another $3.5 million on top of the 3.7 that we'd be saving with the district merger and the middle high school merger. And even though the elementary school consolidation never made it to a vote, we did move forward with the merger study process. Important context around the elementary consolidation, right? I mentioned it going to a vote because in MAUSD, the only way a school closes is if the town where that school sits votes to close it. I probably don't need to describe to you how high a bar that is. So we didn't even go there is how that landed. I actually made a proposal to repurpose schools, so we would still use them. There would be students there on a regular basis. And that proposal was felt by communities as you're closing our small school without asking us to vote. And that was kind of when the withdrawal attempts began in those 2 towns. Just to give you a sense of the kind of reaction that communities had to the thought of repurposing, not even technically closure. So merger study process, that got the green light, we're moving ahead. Using the 706B merger study process, the school boards voted in April of 21 to form a merger study committee that had proportional representation of both Addis Northwest and MAUSD. That committee met regularly for 11 months between the spring of 21 and the fall of 22. We used a consultant that had decades of educational leadership in Vermont, knew the Vermont context well, and the committee studied the benefits and the disadvantages of what a merger could do for our communities. It's fair to say that there was a healthy mix of folks that were skeptical right out of the gate and folks that thought this really maybe had great potential. After 11 months of that careful analysis, the committee determined that the benefits were much greater than the disadvantages. And so they moved it forward for a vote. And you can see I linked the report from that committee so that you could see the advantages and disadvantages, and the structure we used with the consultant was to build that report in the structure of articles of agreement so that in the event that it moved forward, we had that already kind of moving forward. So that's why you see the report structured the way that you do. So following the proper channels, the question of whether or not to merge the 2 districts was warned for a vote, and that vote happened in November of 2022. Leading up to that vote, as you can imagine, there was a lot of effort from the committee, spending months engaging the community, helping them understand the process the committee went through, the advantages and the disadvantages, all the thinking that went into why this is coming to you for a vote. A lot of folks express concern about governance moving further away from their local schools, right? On the heels of Act 46, there in most of our towns, their governance used to be, we have a school board for the elementary school in my town. That had been taken away a bit to be centralized to the district level, and now we're talking about moving it even further away with this larger district. So that was a concern. Others were concerned about loss of identity. You know, they were Commodore Blue to the heart, or they were Mount Eight Maroon to the heart, and that sense of identity and nostalgia really was strong, and they had reservations about losing that identity. In the end, both communities very soundly rejected the merger by more than 2-to-1 margins, and the merger didn't happen, and there hasn't been a conversation about it since. So time marches on. We didn't merge. Since then, I think I can say for sure MAUSD, and I work very closely with Sheila and Addis Northwest. I think it's fair to say that both districts have really struggled to sustain the programming and supports for our students, especially I would say at the secondary level. You know, you can scale a little more easily at the elementary level and not lose programming. When you're trying to scale class size at a secondary level, you end up cutting programs that you're currently offering. You know, course offerings that either stop existing, which we haven't quite had to experience yet, or, you know, district or courses that used to be offered every semester, now every other semester or every other year. Like we're chipping away at what we're being able to provide for our students, and it's having an impact. So in that time, we've continued to see a decline in weighted pupils. We've cut millions of dollars from our budget since the failed merger vote. And thankfully, we have been taking advantage of attrition every chance we get. So we've been able to achieve those millions of dollars in savings, mostly through attrition. But we have reduced several elementary and secondary classroom positions, instructional coaches, coordinators, social emotional interventionists, and a series of other positions, professional and support staff. And outside of phasing out the world language, we haven't lost programs yet at the high school level, but I do say yet that will be coming if we can't find some economies of scale. Each of the reductions, and this is important to note as well, each of the reductions to non-classroom positions has an impact as well, because the folks that are providing that support to building leaders or to classroom teachers are dwindling. And that means more and more of the responsibilities are falling onto the shoulders of building principals and classroom teachers. And I don't have to tell you about the steady stream of legislation that comes out every year around education that requires somebody to do something with. So the pressure to have fewer and fewer people manage more and more responsibilities as legislation is written is a growing burden that ultimately is going to land on building principals and classroom teachers to help share in some of that responsibility. So where we stand now, we're coming on the heels. It took 3 votes to pass our budget last year. We had to cut hundreds of thousands of dollars last year. And despite that much lower level of spending after last year's process, our FY26 budget is actually even lower in spending than where we landed for FY25. Despite that reduction in expenses year over year, we're still looking at an increase in our cost per pupil. So we've cut millions of dollars. We're looking at a tax rate decrease in all of our towns right now. It obviously depends a little bit on what happens where the yield lands. But what shows up on the ballot to our community is, please approve this large number that you don't have a lot of context for, which results in an increase in our cost per pupil. So I'm optimistic because we've done the hard work. I don't think too many districts are spending less next year than they're spending this year. And I don't know how many of our community members will understand that that's happening, because that's not on the ballot. And I guess where I want to end before questions is just, this is one story. There are many stories around Vermont, you know, thinking about what my colleagues Wendy and Randy were sharing about efforts for consolidation and addressing declining enrollment and trying to achieve scale. Mine is just one story. The challenges are real, the fears are legitimate, and the opportunity exists to do better for our students and taxpayers. You often hear the phrase, the devil is in the details, and there's truth in that. I would offer there's also truth that there are angels in the details, and we can be looking for those as well in this time of change. it's harder perhaps to pursue the angels than it is to avoid the devils. But I think that's our task. I think the opportunity here is to really make a difference in the way we deliver education. That's going to, first and foremost, improve opportunity and equity for students, and hopefully and likely save money in pursuit as well. The one thing we know is what we're doing right now isn't an option. That's not sustainable. That won't be what our future is. And we can't get where we want to be by staying where we are now. And the only way I see getting there is very strong leadership from primarily, I think, you as legislators. It's hard for me to imagine the kind of change we're talking about needing to happening without it being legislated. Given the experience I described in the 9 years that we've been here, all of the efforts, all of the pain, all of the challenges we've experienced to pursue scale and do better for our students and taxpayers has resulted in not only nothing changing, the change that has happened has decreased our scale. We've gone the exact opposite direction that we need to go in. And we can't do that anymore. We need help from you all to make this happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. Some questions. I was going to say, okay, what have you learned and what's your message to us? But you kind of hit us, I think, pretty hard at the end. What about the role of, I think about our role, but I was thinking about the role of the other larger, that being the State Board of Education and the Agency of Education. What do you think their role needs to be in all of this?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think about what Wendy was saying about sort of this concept of a Agency of Education, Department of Education. I do think some separation politically has its advantages. Can really focus on primarily what's driving and what's best for the education system without, lots of other sort of competing interests. So I think from a role perspective, I think that's worth consideration. I think the agency or department's ability, and for that matter, perhaps the state board as well, like their authority is somewhat driven by what they're given legislatively. So I think in any event, there's legislation that's going to be needed that either gives folks at the agency. I think the agency will need a different capacity than it has now if it's going to be charged with the kind of change that we're talking about doing. I think the agency as it stands now is staffed primarily with what is necessary for sort of a compliance agency. If we're talking about a change leadership type agency, it's going to need a different level of resource and a different level of authority legislatively to get some things done.
Anything else, committee members? All right. Patrick, thank you very much.
Thank you
Good
for your
luck
time.
as you move into town meeting day.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Before we close, I just want to ask everybody if there are things that they have heard today. We've had a lot of testimony that they just sort of want to throw out as issues for further consideration as a drive for different or other testimony. Beth.
Just the note that it's not just class size, it's grade size. Grade size matters, not just class size.
That's really.
John?
Clear guidance and direction from the state, from us.
I wrote clear, unambiguous directions and guidance.
Yeah, it was clear from almost everyone.
I'm pretty sure I heard that when, that maybe we should be talking about changing the governance structure at the top.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was gonna be mine, yeah, the role of the state board.
Commissioner
and-
versus
and-
secretary.
Exactly.
But I think that there's some concepts that we hadn't considered that Wendy Baker brought up, such as DQS as a tool.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, that was.
Again, as we continue to hear, this also requires the ability of the AOE to support and over a sustained period of time, this level of change.
I just feel like I'm tapping the brake right now. Whoa, like, before we do anything, right? We should really be careful.
Yeah. Okay, if I can just say, I don't know about timeline still, and I totally recognize why that is there, but the testimony we've heard in the last 2 days has been incredibly helpful to put the proposal, I don't want to say the proposal, a proposal into perspective and what we can accomplish so that we don't create more challenges than opportunities. I'm still going to be leaning toward us moving forward to open up more opportunities here. And this, we just have to be very, very careful, as we always known, but now we're seeing it in the field, right in front of us. Important.
I know we've heard it, or especially those of us who are returning on this committee, but I just really appreciate this sort of student focused
Yes.
testimony around the impact of really, really small class sizes and really unstable systems where teachers are having to switch. Obviously, I have personal feelings about that too, but having to switch grade bands, classes, things, and that just the impact that has. And I think I heard in Wendy Baker's testimony, even something we haven't talked about, and I think is a sort of fraught topic, but achievement differences coming out of there's some correlation potentially. I know, and I say that with a huge caveat, would have to go way deeper into data, but achievement differences that are measurable in our classes get really, really.
Part of the issue with that is it's not reportable.
And
I
that-
really, because I hear that a lot, and it's like, you don't even know what the data is because we can't even report it.
Yeah.
Is it fair to say that somebody knows what the data is?
Yeah.
Very few people know what all the data is.
Yeah.
Even school districts can't share it with other school districts' staffs because they're not in the need to know band, right? So district office staff knows it all, but that's really it.
I am really appreciative of Libby Bonesteel's testimony about the issues between Montpelier and Roxbury. And I just wonder in sort of terms of getting the whole picture, whether it might be beneficial to ask someone like from the Roxbury Select Board to come in and talk about what their community, what it's been like in the year since that their community closed, and what that was like from their point of view.
Testimony from Montpelier Roxbury is always fascinating. It is a very, very unique situation.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I guess what I mean is
in
these.
in the sort of joining of a very small rural town and a large community was totally an outlier.
It seems like we're hearing from a lot of people that are like, we closed these schools, it was really hard. Well, I'd like to hear from some of the people that think like, it sucks that you closed those schools, and I wish that you hadn't.
Oh, you'll hear it.
Well, I meant here, I'd like to hear from it here.
I would also go back to, I'd really like to see the data, because I think if the data was done, if that mapping was done, the GIS or whatever it is, it would show that that was an insane move. Those kids shouldn't be traveling up and over a gap to get to us here in Montpelier. Like some other schools should have taken them in, but they wouldn't. And so they didn't really have a place to go. That's why it didn't, it never fitted. It was never supposed to happen.
Okay. I mean, I'm not saying they shouldn't have, I'm not weighing in on what was or wasn't the right decision, but the human element of this, right? Like there's the data element and there's the human element. And I do think that we need to consider the human and Vermont element of this.
Leon, I'm sitting in a large suburban district saying this, so that is a challenging spot to say some of these things from, and I hear that. I'm certainly a little worried about us like reopening or
putting them under a microscope really intense emotions that already exist. And I'm really, not because they don't exist, but because I think much of what we're talking about here, some of this is what healthcare is dealing with, it's a hospital work right now too, but is about, it's not all our committee or even the superintendent's job is not to be community development experts of when a school closes. And so, you know, our job in Montpelier, the legislature, the administration is like, whose is that? Who's gonna do it? You keep talking about a base closing commission, but you know, staying in our lane, not totally cognizant that there is another lane, but staying in our lane of what we can do, because I think we've already asked schools to do too much. So if we're also gonna ask them to sort of solve whatever comes in the wake, that's much more, that's super important, but it's about community identity, about economic development, about housing, about land use. Those are things that that's why this is a collective, this transformation isn't just about education, it's a community and a statewide transformation. And so it's going to take work, buy-in, money and people at the community level doing some of this. It can't all just happen on paper, and it isn't all just going to happen through Title 16 and education stuff. This is much bigger than that, because it's really state, regional and statewide transformation. And we're dealing with a super important part of it, but there's a lot of other pieces to it. I'm a little worried those other pieces don't exist in a very coherent way right now. I mean, I think the NEK did. There was a lot of advocacy today, but like, I think we are struggling to muster much to actually do that part of it. That's what we should be doing.
Josh.
So like a lot of what I heard yesterday, especially today, is that while you want the community involvement, the community is never going to vote to do the thing that might need to be done, right? And that someone has to be the one to make that tough decision. And it seems like it comes back to us in this house, right? Not just this table, but like I heard many, I can probably read, because I put everybody's name, time and date down. And I could probably read how many times that I heard, yes, the community is important, but they are not going to do the thing. Someone else has to use the data and facts to make the decision, because the feelings and emotions are not going to allow the decision to be made.
Yes. But let's say, is there a place in the middle of that?
Yes, thank you. And that was gonna kind of be my point, you know, that you need to balance that community input with not having, but if you leave it up to all the locals to do, are you going to end up with a town that's in an oasis that nobody takes in, and they end up being part of a district that makes no sense for them to be part of? So you can't look at it forest and trees. I mean, you have to look at it, but you have to look at the entire state as a whole, that mapping piece, and say, where does it make sense? What district does it geographically make sense for these schools to be in, so that nobody is left adrift?
I would like to say, this is very, abstraction ladder here. We really only heard testimony about the struggles with dealing with small elementary schools, and how we should learn about high schools and the positives and negatives of scale and size there. Patrick touched on it a little bit as they struggle, and frankly, Virgins and Mount Abe are larger significantly than many high schools, but they're very small. Emily.
I just want to make note when we talk about the community connection, and I've just been through a pretty significant research, looking back, doing studies, presenting to community, and trying to come up with a solution for 3 schools merging into 1 school. And I mean, just recently, the vote didn't take place until, of the 1 community, until January. And nowhere during that time did we as a school board in our community hear people saying exclusively, just don't close my school. It was more like, what are we going to do? What is our next steps? It wasn't a contentious, bad conversation. It wasn't just a shutdown. It was a lot of unanswered questions, confusion, what's going to happen, worry about our kids. When we moved away from that in our communities, we moved away to say, what's our next step? And I think I don't think my communities are alone in that. So they need more, you know, our communities need more on guidance on what the next steps, maybe some, as you just said, where we're just gonna say, we'll do it for you, make the recommendations, but I don't, well, but, I mean, it was a question. So I think there's a middle ground in between. Communities really are looking for answers to this, and I think we can help guide that without.
So it's not about like not having community involvement, right? Like it's saying if they're the ones left to make the decision, the final decision's not gonna happen. So you still have the outreach. So going back to Jay from last Friday, they had community outreach. He said how important it was, but their outreach, from my recollection, was they were doing the process of making the decisions or figuring out what had to happen, and then along the way having those big conversations with the community so they understood the why, the need, the how it was going to get done to get their buy-in, because because if you just say we're closing your school because it's a small school and it doesn't work in this whole big thing, yeah, I would like my small schools too. I would have a hard time. But having the community conversation along the way, which I mean, ultimately is what we're doing publicly in these meetings, we're having this conversation as we go. It's just a matter of who's watching. But it's not about not having a community conversation, but it's about again, if we have the final decision, or do we just do the status quo we've been doing? I don't know, but that's what I heard a lot today.
You know, I just from today's discussion, I can think about, all right. I think one of the things that hovers over us is drawing district lines and having fewer districts. And so do you say, okay, we want to see these districts, but as Wendy said, maybe you let the district itself come together and have its own process as to what it might look like, with clear boundaries set, saying it's not going to look the same. You need to come together under one governance structure. To have scale of school and classes, but then maybe that conversations happens locally, so that people are part of the process.
One concept that has really been troubling me over the last few weeks is we keep hearing this phrase, this observation that no communities are going to vote to close their schools. And I'm wondering if maybe also we need to consider that at face value. No communities are going to vote to close their schools. So like here we are tasked with representing the state of Vermont, and maybe they don't want us to shut down rural Vermont. Like maybe that shouldn't be our job, and we should consider the fact that no communities want to close their schools. I'm not saying that means closing no schools. Obviously we need to change, but I think that with the right data, communities can get there. But like that's important that that's their vote, not that they get a vote. We should consider that.
Totally agree. Vermonters have been very clear. At the local level, when it comes to these decisions, they don't want that kind of change. But at a higher level, they don't want to pay as much for education as they're paying. What I really think we hear a lot of from educators is that we are robbing students of opportunity and the ability to not only have a more education, but a more robust education, more peers and all that. So I think that, we do need to help figure out what is the look of education moving in the future.
I would add to that as an educator at a school that I think does not have the resources that some of our neighboring high schools have, I look forward to the opportunity to join a bigger high school and have more of those resources. So I definitely see that. There are things I want my Hazen kids to have they don't have right now.
And I think that should be on our list of things to
do.
do.
Middle high.
Yeah.
For me, it's middle high.
And maybe that's a way to sell it too. Say, well, these schools are gonna come together. We're also doing a need study and we know you need this, this, and this, and we're gonna make sure that that's on the punch list, right?
One of the pieces of testimony was that Lily Bonesteel was talking about the student that got lottery from Thetford or from Twinfield and how much greater it was and how it changed his high school career. And like what I took and I heard from that was how much greater would it be for all kids at Twinfield if instead of taking that money and having the lottery system and sending it over to this nice high school, we actually were able to get all of the kids at Twinfield that nice stuff. that those good classes. I mean, that's what I think. I realize I just said two totally opposite things.
What about a new regional high school with a tech center that services Danville, Twinfield and Cabot
Yeah.
and anyone in between?
I appreciate
Yes.
it. This was a good lesson to me to say, we gotta leave room for conversation after the.
Yes.
Yes.
But I also would encourage you all to jump in during the testimony, ask questions.
I was just so fascinated by it that I didn't even think of what my questions
It's
are.
good, it's good to digest them.
Can I just leave us with one success story? Because in my SU, where we just had a town vote no, we also had an incredibly successful small school closure, which has got to be going on 10 years ago now. And they merged with a neighboring school, Brookline and Newfane. Brookline closed. They merged into a school now called Newbrook. And, nobody's ever looked back. And it was a very tough decision to make, but once the decision was made, it has been successful ever since, and the kids integrated in very quickly, and it can happen.
Did school construction play a role in that?
No. The fear in that case was what's gonna happen with the school that they were abandoning.
Yeah.
But in the case of Brookline School, they immediately had a proposal in the town to open a childcare center, and that childcare center has been open ever since. Changed hands once.
It was, but Newbrook was not a new school. It didn't require.
It had enough
Major.
capacity to take, it had enough space to take with that. They had just completed a little while earlier, an expansion and renovation, so that was already done. There were some, the details that we heard from the VASBO yesterday. Those things all brought it back to me about the things we had debt and all that they had to figure out, but it worked. And it was very successful, and it still is.
Right, on that successful note, we'll stop there.